Hello, everyone. My name is Cynthia. We're going to get started shortly, just waiting for the number of participants to rise. But while we're waiting for that, just to let you know that we are using the Zoom platform today. If any of you have any issues at all, myself and my colleague Carla are here to help. Please do use the chat box and the Q&A box to ask any questions throughout the webinar so that we can have our wonderful panelists answer them for you. Yeah, so we'll just wait a moment. So I just want to take this opportunity to introduce Marcia Jones, who is our chair, as well as the global head of corporate responsibility at RELX, who's going to just be introducing the UN Global Compact to us.
Thank you very much, Cynthia, and I'm delighted to take part in this very important series on Black Lives Matter in business. Today, we're going to be focusing on retention. I just want to say thank you to NatWest Group for their generous sponsorship of this series, and also for Crown Agents Bank and their support of the session today on retention. A little bit later, after Cynthia will explain about the genesis of this series, and Steve Kenzie, the executive director of the UK network of the UN Global Compact, takes over. He will introduce our impressive speakers today, but I want to just add mine at the outset to Dennis, Naomi, Warren, and Marcia for participating and sharing with us today from their expertise. But next slide. So as you can see here, we are part of the world's largest responsible business initiative, which connects companies and other organizations in a global movement dedicated to driving sustainable growth. There are just over 15,000 participants of the UN Global Compact worldwide, and about 10,000 business signatories. And the Global Compact is building on 10 principles related to, as you can see with those icons, human rights, labor, environment, and anti-corruption. We have some commitments as signatories to the Global Compact, like reporting annually on how we have lived those 10 principles in our businesses. And we also have many opportunities through the Global Compact to support the wider UN development agenda. I want to flag that the UN Global Compact UK network is a really vital way of engaging with the UN Global Compact and just bringing a network of businesses, but civil society partners as well, to engage on the issues surrounding the 10 principles, including this important topic of Black Lives Matter. So next slide. This is a slide where we just want to show you that on the left side, it's a little bit small, but we've got the 10 principles of the Global Compact. And on the right-hand side, we have the Sustainable Development Goals. 2020 is such a challenging year for everyone due to COVID-19, but it's also a year that marks the 20th anniversary of the UN Global Compact. It's the 75th anniversary of the UN, and it is also the 5th year of the SDGs. And what you can see with those interconnecting lines is how interconnected the 10 principles of the Global Compact are to the SDGs. And what we particularly want to highlight for you is that with the SDGs, there is a really strong link to Black Lives Matter. We've highlighted SDG 8, promoting sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all. SDG 10, reducing inequality within and among countries. SDG 6, to promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, and to provide access to justice for all, and to build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. And of course, SDG 17, strengthening the means of international implementation and to revitalize the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development. So I'm going to stop there and hand over to you, Cynthia, to walk us through how we ended up developing this. And I look forward to joining everyone after I've learned from all the experts today.
Thank you, Marcia. It's funny because yesterday, actually, I was reading something that brought back all the emotions that I felt went back in May. All of the emotions that I felt off the back of the death of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement picking up. I was heavily moved, and not moved with anger, with frustration, with hopelessness, until something changed and I realized that I have a sphere of influence here, as we all do, and we all have to do something about it. I put it to the team that we should not only be doing something in this space because we are the UN Global Compact Network UK, but as every organization needs to be doing something. And so Carla and I actually developed this 6-part webinar series with the hope of really giving companies tangible takeaways that they could, listen to what's being said, listen to the information that's being shared, go back to their companies and actually actualize it. And so we developed a 6-part series, as I said, and the first one was storytelling, where we looked to harness the power of storytelling to impact action. The second one, we looked at different ways to start looking at language, looking at ethnicity pay gap reporting, as well as the difference between anti-racist training and unconscious bias training. And then a couple of weeks ago, we had a really great webinar with Cynthia V. Davis from Bain Recruitment, where we looked at how is it that you can actually, start getting more Black talent within your businesses. And today, of course, we're going to be having how can we retain people like me within your organizations. And we have another 2 webinars coming up in the month of November, which I'm very excited about. In particular, our Changing Corporate Culture, in which is going to be a high-level panel with our CEO and Executive Director of the UN Global Compact, Sanda Onjiambo. So I think that's all I have. Okay, next slide, please. So this is the agenda for today. It is really, really simple. We've just done the welcome. I've just introduced the Black Lives Matter and webinar series to you guys. We are going to have an hour panel discussion. So I feel like that's a good chunk of time to get out what you need to understand about retention. And then finally, we're going to have Marcia come back and wrap up what's been discussed in a final call to action for the businesses. So I just want to hand over now to Steve Kenty, our Executive Director, who is going to be moderating the panel.
Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you, Marcia. Thank you all for joining us today for this really important conversation, because I think it was, the previous sessions in the program, it's been really clear that it's a big agenda and it's a holistic agenda. It's not enough just to hire more Black people into the company. It's what do you do then? And there needs to be equality throughout in every step of the way, that there's access to advancement, and that there's attention being paid to retaining, making sure that there's a culture in the company that is welcoming and fair. And we've got a fantastic group of speakers today to discuss this further. Marcia Jones is the Group Head of Human Resources and Executive Vice President at Crown Agents Bank. She's got more than 25 years of human resource management experience. And thanks very much, Marcia, for your support for today's webinar. Dennis Owusu-Sem is the Oversight Relationship Manager at the Bank of Montreal Global Asset Management. He's also the founder of Success Talks, which profiles some of the leading BAME individuals throughout the world and has been featured in many major media outlets. Naomi Kelman, Senior Manager for Schools and Universities at Rare Recruitment, is also the founder of Target Oxbridge, which is a program that has helped over 200 Black, African, and Caribbean students secure Oxbridge offers. And she also co-founded the BAME Fast Stream Network and the Oxford Black Alumni Network. So very, very busy indeed. And lastly, Warren Wellington is a solicitor at Latham and Watkins, a global law firm, and also co-founder and chair of the Black British City Group. Welcome to you all. It's really a pleasure to have you here. Now, I'm thinking at this point, Carla, that we might stop. We could probably turn off the screen sharing and give bigger pictures of all of us panelists. There we go. That's better, and then we can have a better chat. So let's get started. Maybe just I'd like to hear from you all on this, but let's start with Marcia. What do you think are the key factors when it comes to Black retention within different organizations, and yours in particular?
Well, I think from my perspective, I think that communication and conversations are some of probably the primarily most important key factors. Being brave to speak out about race and being prepared to educate all levels of managers in understanding the benefits of having a diverse organization, to be able to have open and honest dialogues. I think that's what I would say as a starting point. I think also accountability is key. Once an organization discloses, there is an imperative to improve their figures, whether this is about pay or numbers in senior roles. And talking about race is hard. It's often very difficult for people to do that. But as people can become more comfortable with having those uncomfortable conversations, I think we will see some of those difficulties being broken down. I think also creating role models, future leaders, by celebrating successful individuals who will show it is possible to be successful. I think that's really a very important factor, one of the key factors. And ensuring that policies and mandatory training are inclusive and they are non-discriminatory, including things like unconscious bias training for all, which can, if they're done properly, can really help to shift the perception and therefore also help to change the culture.
Thanks, Marcia. That's a very comprehensive answer. Dennis, have you got anything to add?
Yeah, I think, as you said, that's quite a comprehensive answer, and I definitely agree. Role models are definitely important. If I was to add to that, I would look at the data, because fundamentally, when you're working with businesses, we measure our success by data. If you don't measure it, you can't actually see whether you're being successful or not. And so getting data, obviously, around the ethnicity pay gap is one aspect, but then two, actually tracking where your professionals are within the business and how long it takes for them to progress from, say, analyst level to associate level. Because if it takes a white person, say, 3 years to make that progression, but it takes a Black person 5 years, there is a problem within itself. And if that happens across the board, you kind of need to work out what exactly you're doing wrong, so to speak. I definitely think there should be aspirational goals for companies, because if you don't have the aspiration and you don't communicate that, as Marcia said, then people might lose a bit of confidence as to what your plan is moving forward. And lastly, I think it's important to delineate the term BAME, because at the end of the day, treating everyone as an other, you tend to lose the Black in the whole conversation. And I think with the recent heightened attention to racial inequality in the world and the workforce as a subsect of that, it's important that we actually focus on that and move forward.
Thanks, Dennis. Naomi, would you like to come in?
Yes, I very much agree with Dennis's point on data. At Rare, we recently launched the Race Fairness Commitment, which firms have signed up to, and it's a commitment to actively monitor and measure these questions of retention, because as Dennis mentioned, if you're not monitoring the data, you often don't know how big your problem is, and therefore you don't know how to go about solving it. And so firms who sign up have committed to looking regularly at how people progress, not just looking at BAME as a whole, but looking at specific ethnic groups, and also what we call the ethnicity state gap. So how long are people staying at the firm or the organization? And when you look at your white employees, do they stay for longer than, say, your black employees? And how big is that gap? And when people leave, are you doing exit interviews that ask why they're leaving and provide space for people to speak about their own experience and how their ethnicity might have impacted their experience and the reasons they chose to leave? I also think, on top of the role models point, which is very important, there's a key place for sponsorship and mentorship, and sometimes reverse mentoring. And we've seen that be very helpful, because as much as people who are trying to come up through an organization need support, and sometimes they don't get informal support, and therefore structured mentoring can be really important for filling that gap. Also, reverse mentoring allows people in leadership to fully understand the experiences of more junior people, sometimes from very different backgrounds to them, who are having experiences that leadership aren't aware of.
Thanks, Naomi. Warren, is there anything left for you to fill in?
Thanks, Steve. And yeah, absolutely agree with all of the points raised by Marcia, Dennis, and Naomi. I mean, look, I completely agree. Organizations need to start with the data in order to identify where the churn is occurring, and whether it's disproportionately occurring with their black employees in comparison to their white counterparts, which, as the data shows, at least when it comes to law firms, many of whom work with RARE actually, it often occurs at that junior level. And there are many factors that come into play when it comes to retention, quality of work, intellectual rigor, prestige for people, or even the salary, all of the same features which will attract any employee to any given workplace. But I think the most important factor of all is the culture. And when we talk about culture, I'm talking about the people at the organization, whether the firm itself is taking positive action to address the fact that people have joined from different backgrounds and different starting positions. Those are really the pulling factors that might outweigh any other features of other organizations which might pull any given employee. When it comes to black employees in particular, from my experience, and I've recently moved, by the way, from another law firm to the law firm I'm currently with, I think it's really about your day-to-day experiences. The people you work with in your teams, the wider firm may have a number of initiatives or events which suggest that they're doing a lot in the D&I space, but what is that trickling down to the local managers or local leads, partners, directors? Do they take the time to understand and embrace cultural differences within their teams and stamping out microaggressions, making it very clear that that sort of thing is unacceptable? A lot of which happens at the Friday night drinks, which kind of leads me into my next point in terms of like group norms and traditions. I think a lot of partners and directors, managers alike are often sort of blindly very comfortable with what's been done for years and years and years. Many of whom have been at the same firm for 20 plus years. They've always had a ski trip. They've always taken someone perhaps to pheasant shooting or whatever it may be that they do, which is actually true. I've been there in the room with partners who are getting on very well with trainees and other associates who share those interests, and I just can't relate. Now the drinks every Friday is great for me, but I think all of that is fine in combination with other things, other group activities, but taken in isolation, that is quite exclusionary, right? I mean, finally, I think all of this leads to whether you can see yourself at the organization in the long term. And I think as Black employees, no matter your class, you probably come from a background where your parents or grandparents have been telling you from a very young age that you have to work harder than your white counterparts, and you're always going to be on the lookout for the next opportunity if you don't think you're going to get ahead at your current organization. So I think it's very important to have sponsors and mentors in place that make it clear that you do have a future at this organization, and not just saying that your exit interview, but also at your regular check-ins.
Thanks very much, everyone. You've already given me probably 2 hours worth of stuff that I'd like to follow up on. So one thing that I'd never heard of before that I want to come back to is this stay gap idea that Naomi mentioned. Is that something, is that data that is routinely collected? Are you collecting that at Crown Agents, Marcia? Is that a black and white thing, or is that an ethnicity? I mean, clearly the gap part is tracking that there's an ethnic and race component, but is that something routinely captured for all employees?
It's not something that we're doing, but it'd be interesting to hear a little bit more from Naomi about that.
Yeah.
It's something that at Rare we're trying to encourage firms to sign up to starting to consider and regularly monitoring. And so it came out of some research that we did looking at firms and who started at the firm, looking at it across different ethnic minority groups, not just using the BAME umbrella, but looking specifically at Black employees versus white employees and Asian employees, etc. And then seeing how long did people stay, and did some groups stay longer than others. And the research did show that ethnic minority lawyers, and particularly Black lawyers, weren't staying as long as white lawyers at firms, and so we're moving elsewhere. And to the point that was made earlier, it's brilliant to be recruiting diversely, and we're seeing a lot of firms doing a really good job at that now. So the next question is, how do we retain that talent? And being aware of that gap will be very important to any organisation trying to improve their retention, because if you know you have a gap, then you can ask yourself why and how do we start closing it. And then to the point of accountability that was made earlier, that data point also helps create that, because you can set an intention to close it by a certain point, and if it's not closing, you can be asking questions why. And so the race fairness commitment is trying to get organisations to sign up to regularly monitoring that and then working towards closing that gap.
Is there an easily accessible tool or methodology, or a recognized methodology that we could direct people to that want to start doing this within their organizations?
We've put some guidance out. So I've shared into the question box the link to the race fairness commitment, and I think Carla really kindly did as well. And so that sets out some guidance for people who are interested in starting to consider this and gathering that data. And for some organizations, they might not actually have very up-to-date data on ethnicity, and some organizations find that they want to start doing this work and they realize that they haven't got high levels of response rates to that. So sometimes you have to start collecting it to find out who is in the organization from different groups, and then you can start tracking. And so it's about joining it up across different parts of the HR process and having that data to refer to.
So if anyone missed that, in the Q&A box, there are 3 tabs at the top: open questions and answered questions and dismissed questions. So you can find the answers to those questions that Naomi referenced in the answered section there, if you didn't see it when it went up in the first place. Now, I'm sure Naomi wasn't speaking about you specifically, Warren, but you did mention that you had recently changed firms, and she just mentioned that Black lawyers tend to do that more than others. Without getting too personal, a perception that your current firm had a better future for you than the one you were at. Can you share us anything about? And if not, don't go anywhere you're not comfortable with. But it's just we got a case study right here before us. I can't resist asking.
Yeah, absolutely, Steve. No problem at all. Yeah, I mean, like I said, there are many factors which come into play when it comes to any employee leaving, whether Black or otherwise. And in my case, it was no different. But I would admit that there weren't the same pull factors in terms of people and culture that I would say some of my white colleagues might have in terms of staying because of the meaningful relationships, regardless of necessarily there being another option out there that might offer, say, better quality of work or better pay. I would also say, without going into too much detail, that the firm that I'm at now does a lot of work in the D&I space and focuses, actually has a Black lawyers group. So we differentiate between ethnicities. We don't just refer to BAME, multiculturalism. We don't just run events for the sake of running events. We actually host training for example, we host training for trainees to ensure that they're ready to qualify as associates at the firm. We really want Black employees to get ahead, and I think that makes a massive difference, and it fosters a sense of community. Furthermore, there's also the pipeline for future partners, and there are existing Black partners at Latham & Watkins, the firm I'm at now. So we have 5 Black partners in London and 30 worldwide, whereas the firm I was at previously had 0. And I think there's only 8 Black partners across the Magic Circle law firms, and that's out of about 800 odd partners. So I'd say at the start of my profession, and even when I was looking into the law, it was very much a given that you wouldn't have Black partners at a firm, whereas now I think that's starting to change, and there are competitor firms and organizations which are doing a lot better on the diversity front than other firms. So I think that's definitely something to bear in mind, that diversity and inclusion initiatives as well as representation at firms is starting to be a point which me personally, I definitely took into consideration, and I think others are too.
Unmute. So it's been mentioned about the need for having role models and people in senior positions, as you've noted, is critical. So maybe even taking it more to an even more practical, personal level, and to talk about mentorship schemes. Dennis, have you been a mentee or a mentor? Do you see that as something that would add value to you in your decision to stay somewhere?
From my perspective, yes. I think mentoring is really important because it allows you to have a sounding board. It allows you to talk to someone about some of your fears, whether they're rational or irrational. And quite frankly, it could actually be the difference between someone staying or leaving because they don't feel as they belong, or having that person to be able to talk them out of it, be able to talk through certain problems, actually get them to stay and actually show a bit more resilience could be the way forward. And so mentoring is very important. But while I appreciate that as well, I think that sponsorship is probably even more important than mentoring when it comes down to like retention, because at the end of the day, having someone who's there to be your champion when you're not in the room, to be the person that can give you those stretch assignments that fully allow you to demonstrate your ability and to actually build your profile within the company. It then helps to build that virtuous cycle because they say, okay, Warren, he's doing great work. He did great work on this project. We're now going to give him something a bit more to demonstrate his ability. He's done really well at that. It now goes throughout the firm. Okay, Warren's a rising star. We need to give him more opportunities. It just allows you to feel as though, one, you feel like you want to be part of the company, and two, you're getting that intellectual stimulation, you're getting that support, and then you really have that fast track on the way to the top. And a lot of sponsorship relationships are down to whether someone likes you or not. And as I think someone mentions, that whether you go to the pub on that Friday evening, whether you go pheasant shooting, and you can build that bond outside of work, it then allows you to bring that trust into work and then into the projects that you're doing and allow you to progress in that regard. And so mentoring, yes, while it's important and while it's vital, it is great. If you really want to make that change, that long lasting change, I think we have to have those sponsorship programs that really provide people with that opportunity to grow within the company.
So do you have in your company, one could have an informal mentorship arrangement, maybe a mentor outside the company, or there could be a more structured approach. Is the same true with a sponsor? That's clearly needs to be somebody almost with more of a line management role that you're reporting into. But how would you distinguish between the two, and do you have a more formalized sponsorship
So
program?
with my situation, it's quite interesting because in the last few weeks, well, I would say months, because of the work that I do outside of work, it's given me more profile in work, and that's actually allowed me to create a relationship with our ex-com and our actual CEO, and we've now established a reverse mentoring relationship. And it's only been a few months, but I can already see the difference it's already made in terms of certain doors opening, certain opportunities coming about, certain conversations that I would not necessarily ordinarily get access to, but I now do have. And it does make your perception of how you feel about the company change completely. So from my perspective, yes, it has made a difference, and I can see how it could make a difference. The challenge is not everybody knows how to go about establishing those relationships with those senior people. And sometimes the senior people don't even see that there's a willingness for Black employees to actually want that type of relationship. Some people think that because they're silent, it means that they're not interested. But really, it could mean that because they don't know how to have that conversation to establish that relationship to move forward. And so I think it works both ways. Yes, the company needs to put programs in place to encourage the mentoring and the sponsorship. But then also, I think we need to have a bit more confidence to demand these types of things, to be able to get that encouragement going so that we can actually take our rightful seat at the table as well.
So having examples in play can inspire, hopefully, and encourage that. Marcia, do you have that situation? Do you have formalized programs to facilitate mentoring relationships, sponsoring relationships to come together at the bank?
Sorry, I was on mute. We don't have any formal mentoring program, but I have to say, going back to the opening that was said about with the incidents that happened back in May with George Floyd, it has definitely made my organization start looking at ways in which we can do things differently. And some of the things that we haven't been doing is to look at how we can implement some of those things to bring about change. And mentoring is one of the things that we've been discussing and talking about, looking at putting together a mentoring scheme. So my organization is approximately 180 employees. So, it's not a huge organization, but, it doesn't stop us from being able to run a mentoring program. We have a diverse workforce across the organization. I would say perhaps more so at the lower level than more so at the senior level. So we've been having discussions since all the incidents that's been happening throughout the summer around putting together some more initiatives, that is not just lip service initiatives, but actual initiatives that will help to raise our young people's ability for them to see that they've been supported and to help them in developing their career as to where they can, where they can go. I will come back to what Warren said about, mentoring is good, but I also believe that sponsorship is probably a stronger initiative to take on board. And sometimes I do feel that sometimes Black professionals can be seen to be over-mentored, and what they actually need is to have someone who will sponsor them, because very often a person in leadership position that can open door for them, who will be able to stand up and represent them when they enter a room. So mentorship for me, if it's done properly, it does help, but it can only if it is done with integrity. And what I mean by that is, if it's done holistically, and that mentoring is not just one way, especially when the topic that we're talking about in improving diversity and awareness of unfairness and inequality with Black people. So I think that, this is where the senior leader is also being mentored in how to deal with challenges they face in understanding and supporting and committing to being champions and sponsors for Black professionals in their organization. And I think non-Black to Black mentorship may also work very well with non-Black potentially becoming aware of some of the cultural differences and challenges that Black people face in order to progress within an organization.
That's just where I was going next. And I think Samuel's question sort of speaks to that too, because I'm assuming, Dennis, that your reverse mentoring relationship is probably with a non-Black person, and just obviously given the paucity of Black people in senior management, that non-Black to Black relationship is probably most likely. And is that I mean, on the one hand, until there are more Black people in senior management positions, it's going to have to be that way. Is that does that pose a challenge? As you say, you've almost characterized it as reverse mentoring, because you have to presumably do a big educating role to make these people understand better what you're experiencing. But it works.
I think it's a good point, and it's the fact that there's currently a lack of representation in these positions, and so when it does come to the sponsorship aspect, it's probably most likely going to have to be not white to Black ordinarily. But I think it's important that the person who is doing the sponsoring has an open mind and is willing to use their social capital to make the difference, because at the end of the day, we want to reach a point whereby everyone has the fair shot at being successful in the company. I also think they should look at it both ways, because I've spoken to a few senior white leaders in different companies, and some of them are, they want to show that they can support, but they don't necessarily know how to show that support. They don't necessarily know what to say. And they realize that if they say something and it turns out to be wrong, then the backlash towards them could actually be quite detrimental. But I think by having a reverse mentoring relationship with someone who's a bit more junior or from a different background, it can give you that insight the person needs to actually understand, okay, what is it like as a Black professional? Maybe even discuss the terminology that you should be using, because there are certain white males that are not comfortable using the term Black. They were brought up saying that Black is offensive and they can't be using that. So they're not necessarily up to date in that regards. And so while it's important that you need to establish those relationships, yes, it's going to be with a non-Black person. But if you look at it from a London perspective, for example, BAME is 41%, Black is 11%. And so if you're looking at it from a proportional representation, certain companies, if they want to be more reflective of the society that they serve, they should actually use that as an initiative to have that as an aspirational target.
Thank you. I'm wondering, Naomi, from your perspective in the recruitment space, does it look good on a CV to say that you're a mentor or a sponsor? Is that something that people do talk about, that a recruiter would look for, that someone has experience in doing that?
I think the important thing within organizations when that work's being done is that it's recognized. And so I think that's where I probably shift the focus, because quite often when that sort of work is being done, it's not always considered in the same way as, the core day-to-day work. And so when people are getting involved with, say, organizing Black Employee Network events, all those sorts of mentorship or sponsorship programs, that work isn't always rewarded within appraisals or assessments of performance in the same way as the standard day-to-day work. And so I think the thing that we need to do first is have organizations recognize that sort of input, because if an organization is very committed to improving diversity, inclusion and retention, they need to be supporting people who carry out the work that's very important to making that happen, and ensure that people get the recognition. So I think we need to have that accomplished first, and then when people are recruiting, that might be something people are looking out for. I think we need to have that mindset shift first, where organizations are really valuing and rewarding that sort of input. And if it's okay, I just want to make a point on the sponsorship question that was being discussed earlier, because I think quite often sponsorship is quite an informal thing. And human nature means that people quite often take someone under their wing when that person reminds them of them. That's a younger version of me. Oh, we've got this in common. Oh, I see a bit of myself in them. And so my challenge to senior leadership is to reflect on who is it that you've taken under your wing in the past, and why. How much of it was to do with affinity that you felt you had naturally with somebody, and how much of it was to do with wanting to develop talent regardless of what that person's background is, and how much of it was to do with focusing on your organization's goals in terms of diversity? Because I think what we naturally find is we've quite often naturally helped people quite similar to us. And if we challenge ourselves to actually look out for talent, regardless of background, people in senior positions might find themselves sponsoring different people, always for the sake of, improving talent within the business, but hopefully that should be from a spread of backgrounds.
Right, that's where unconscious bias sneaks in. Well, to be a slight devil's advocate around sponsorship, a more negative take might be that it's just favoritism, but I suppose, again, there's a balancing act to be done there. But how do you distinguish? Is that, Warren, we haven't heard from you for a little while. Do you have experience of being sponsored? And is that, or have you experienced seeing someone else being sponsored and wondering why they were getting those benefits and you weren't?
Yeah, so I have had experience being sponsored, and I mean, sponsorship is a difficult thing. As Naomi says, it is typically informal. I've never heard of there being a sponsorship scheme. You can't allocate someone a sponsor, in my opinion anyway. I think the sponsor needs to have seen your work. They need to be able to vouch for you. The question is, though, who are they choosing to vouch for? Who are they choosing to give the stretch allocations to those tasks which are really going to stretch you and get you known around the office? And I think in terms of actions that organizations can take, it's about those in those positions of authority, those who are the local managers, the heads of their teams, those who are in charge of distributing work allocation within the teams, should be given the unconscious bias training that is required, so that favoritism which you mentioned, Steve, doesn't creep in when they are choosing employees to take under their wing and to vouch for when it comes to bonuses, promotions, the like. But I do think it is quite interlinked with mentorship, in the sense that if you have a good mentor, they will give you hints and tips on how to convert someone into a sponsor. And hopefully your mentor can also be your sponsor in certain circumstances anyway. But again, I think it comes down to your mentor being well trained as a mentor, having done the unconscious bias training, and hopefully your mentor is also a reverse mentee in some senses, in that they're confident enough to ask the same questions that a reverse mentee might ask. So I think for anyone on this call who is a mentor, as Dennis alluded to earlier, it's really important that you do speak to your Black mentees quite openly about race. I don't think it should be the elephant in the room by any means. Ask them what their experience is in your team as a Black employee. It might be positive, it might not, but you just need to make sure that they're comfortable talking to you about those issues. It doesn't matter whether you're Black or white, it's just about whether they can talk to you about it and feel confident and comfortable doing so.
Thank you. Now, we've got an anonymous question that I actually meant to steer you away, Warren, because you're mentioning that you have a sort of an employee group, but how can non-Black employees be effective allies to their Black colleagues? I'd be interested in everybody's views on this, but I suppose where you have an employee resource group, do you exclude non-Black colleagues from that, or does it undermine it if you let them in, or does it undermine it worse if you don't? What do you all think about that?
It's a great question. And look, as I said, at Latham Watkins, we have a Black lawyers group, and it is quite unusual, I would say, especially in the UK. It's far more common in the US to delineate in terms of ethnicity between affinity groups. The US love an affinity group, as you know, but we don't exclude anyone from those groups. We had a lunch, a socially distanced lunch. It was like 6 of us more recently, and there were Black and white people there. But often you find the people who attend these sorts of things or join the groups align with another minority group. I often find that a lot of allies tend to be already identify themselves as, say, LGBT, or are a woman, or might, in our case at Latham anyway, be a part of a first generation lawyer network, for example. I really think it would be effective if someone who doesn't necessarily identify as a minority whatsoever, you know, white British male, white British women in some instances, were to actually not just tune off when they hear about affinity groups or the multiculturalism network, and get involved, you know, and that doesn't mean attending every meeting. I think, I'll be honest, I do think there's a line. I think, personally, I think, especially when it comes to social events, it's all well and good. It's great actually having allies there, but I think there do need to be certain events which are intended to be a safe space, or there needs to be some sort of channel whereby people from minority groups within the workplace can feel as though they can talk openly and freely about the experiences they have at said organization.
Did anyone else want to comment on this or have an experience around this point?
Yeah, I echo everything that Warren said. I think from my experience, there's been lots of white people who have said, yeah, what can I do to do more, because I feel helpless right now. I think, as Warren said, it's about having the conversation, but I think it's before you have the conversation, don't necessarily put the onus on the Black person to be providing that education. I think it's important that you could probably do some reading yourself. There's plenty of books out there. I would recommend that you do things from a UK perspective, because although there are similarities between the US and the UK, there are subtle differences. Books such as Afua Hirsch's British, or Natives by Carla, or Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, that could be a good way to get that foundation knowledge. And then it's about having the conversation. If you're still curious, to be able to say, look, I've read this, I care to share your thoughts, and don't necessarily force the person that you're talking to have an answer, because some people are just not comfortable themselves. Even though they might be Black, they may not necessarily have the knowledge or the articulation to be able to express themselves adequately. And so it's about doing the background research, being empathetic and listening to people, and not necessarily being too pushy when it comes to those things. And then also, you can obviously have the conversation with your white friends once you've done the education, and maybe correcting things where you don't necessarily think they're right, and when you're saying things behind closed doors. Because I think when things are said behind closed doors, sometimes they manifest themselves outwardly, whereas if you can actually start tackling that behind closed doors, it will make a difference going forward.
If I could add to that point as well about being an ally, I find that quite often the people who feel responsible for raising the question of race when it comes to issues within an organisation are often people of ethnic minority backgrounds. And that can be quite tiring after a while. You can feel that you're carrying a burden, and you also feel a bit worried that you will become the person who everyone thinks is always banging on about race. And because it's important, it needs to be done. And if no one else is doing it, you will do it. But sometimes that burden does not fall fairly. And so for people who are interested in being allies, I think people are often much more comfortable bringing up questions of gender or sexuality or class than they are speaking about race. And I've not really been in many settings in other contexts where the person who's raised the "have we thought about race here, or what can we be doing to make sure we're reaching out to different groups from an ethnicity perspective," is someone who's not someone from a white background. And so I think that's something to ask, you know, have you raised that recently when you realize it's been missing? And if you're wanting to be an ally, it is about speaking up in the same way you would about other groups from minoritized backgrounds. Would you also speak up about race? That's something to think about when you're wanting to be an ally.
Oh, great.
And also one quick point, just adding on to that, I think it's another example could be when you're in meetings. If you have the power in the meeting, sometimes allowing a Black person to have the opportunity, who may be a bit uncomfortable or not necessarily having the confidence to actually say anything, you can be like, Dennis, what are your thoughts on this? And allow them to demonstrate their ability. That could be quite helpful in utilizing the power that you naturally have to bring others into the conversation.
I also think that's really powerful. Standing up for and speaking out for Black colleagues in situations such as at meetings and in my personal experience, more so social events. You know, where those nights when you're at the drinks, when you're getting closer to the deal team, you're getting closer to your colleagues, and people aren't necessarily being as politically correct as they might always be. When someone says something that you as an ally think is out of turn, don't necessarily just look at the one Black person in the room and see how they react. You speak up instead, and I think that is really powerful. And I think as an ally, I wouldn't say the onus is on an ally to do so or a Black person to do so, but I think often Black people or anyone of an ethnic minority group in those situations can feel really vulnerable, and almost like the spotlight is on them and everyone's recording how they're about to react, and how they react. They're reacting on the whole of their race, on behalf of their race, right? And I think in those instances, allies can be extremely powerful and helpful. And I think those are the sorts of actions when people say, you know, do the reading, do the training, attend events, but then put it into action in your everyday life. Those are the kind of circumstances we're talking about.
Thanks, Warren. Marcia, did you want to come in too?
I was going to come in, Steve, but I think it's all been said already. But I totally agree with everything, especially what Naomi says, you know, about Black people always feel as though they have to be the person that speaks up. And yes, we do need to speak up at the right time, in the right circumstances, in the right places, but we shouldn't have to be feeling that it's something that we have to do all the time. We need a better understanding of my white counterparts to understand, you know, that they need to do some learning as well. And I believe, you know, that this is something that we all have to share, is that we have to educate, but people have to also take responsibility in educating themselves, so that we don't always feel the pressure that we are having to do that ourselves all the time.
I think that's a really, really important point to take away, that we would stand up. You'd expect leaders of any race to step up around any breach of an important policy. And we wouldn't just look to women to stand up for gender rights, and we shouldn't be looking just to Black people to be standing up here. I think that's absolutely critical and a responsibility that we've all got to take on. Going back to the Q&A box, we have one directed to you, Naomi, but I think, as always, probably interesting to hear from you all, but how would organizations best handle policies around combining continuing education with working for Black employees, making the point here that Black employees are likely, as I think Warren said earlier, or maybe it was Dennis, but having to work harder. And so trying to combine further education with working. Do you see specific policies around that, or that are sort of ethnic in origin?
I think generally it's hard to be really specific without knowing the industry context, but generally speaking, I think policies for time off for further study are normally the same across everybody within an organization. I think the important question here would be, is that person getting support when it comes to career planning and understanding how that qualification might contribute to them furthering their career? When I think about the students we work with, there's sometimes some misconceptions about what you need to get on. And so sometimes students think, for example, they really need to go and do a master's to get into certain roles. And sometimes that's not the case at all. And actually, they'd better spend their time getting straight into the industry and picking up specific experience and skills along the way. And it differs for each industry. But the point is, if you don't have somebody like a mentor or a sponsor to give you that advice, so that the things you're investing in are the right things, that can become a challenge. And so I imagine most organizations would have the policy being the same for everyone in terms of time off work for study. The question is everyone getting good advice about what's going to help them progress in the organization? Is it a qualification, or is it actually taking on different and more stretching responsibilities within your actual role?
Thank you. Another anonymous question for Black employees: are there any external mentee-mentor platforms that are either focused for Black individuals or just generally more inclusive? No. So I'm wondering, Dennis, you posted in the chat, forget a mentor, find a sponsor. Is that a book or an article, or is that a platform?
That's a book, because I think it's in response to someone who wanted to know a bit more about sponsorship and where they could, because it was the first time they'd heard the concept. And so that's a book which I think gives a good background as to what it means and what it looks like. And it was looking at it mainly from the perspective of gender, but there are certain similarities with race that can be drawn from that. In terms of other platforms, obviously I'm naturally biased, and I'm going to mention Success Talks. In terms of the conferences that we do, whereby we take executives, not only from America and the UK, but also Africa, to give professionals the insights that they need to progress within their career. We did a conference earlier this year with over 1,500 participants. But also, I think there's other groups that I'm a part of, such as the Black British City Group, which I'm sure Warren will be able to tell us more about. There's other platforms such as BYP, where you can go and learn from different speakers about what you need to get ahead as well. There's lots of different platforms out there. It's just a matter of identifying it. So yeah, I'll hand over to Warren to explain more about BBCG.
Thanks, Dennis. Yeah, so Dennis is a much valued member of BBCG. And by way of background, the Black British City Group is a network of Black professionals spanning across from law, banking, accounting, but primarily that focus is on city professionals. And what we are really is a network which provides a safe space for Black professionals to discuss matters to do with their career, as well as the impact that they can have on the wider community. So we ensure that Black professionals give back by way of financial contributions, as well as by using our skills and resources to advise Black businesses, Black-owned charities, and also pay it forward by mentoring young people. But more specifically with regards to mentors, we do expose a lot of our members to more senior professionals. So at our members meetings, we always have someone come in. More recently, we had a managing director at BlackRock deliver a speech. Previously, we've had a partner at Latham & Watkins deliver a talk on different topics, and they're excellent because we have about 40 or 50 people in the room, and you get really senior individuals who are kind of delivering hard cold facts about their career, and kind of like locker room talk that you wouldn't necessarily get on talks like these, which are a bit more public. So yes, I think it's a great question in terms of external networks, because I think as one person mentioned on the Q&A, proportionate representation looks like perhaps one Black partner or MD at a firm, for some firms anyway, for some of the smaller ones. So perhaps it is worth some organizations looking to external organizations where their employees can have that lateral and that upward looking support. So in terms of having their peers who they can speak to and liaise with and gain from their experiences in terms of diversity and inclusion best practices, as well as speaking to mentors. But of course, sponsors need to be internal, so you can't outsource a sponsor.
Thank you. Okay, we're running down on our time now, and there's just a couple. Well, one question that's just come up that I was thinking about how to frame it, and now I can pass the buck, I suppose. This question, anonymous question, but about microaggressions, because I think as an ignorant person myself, I could see this being the kind of thing that I would just through lack of awareness and my own cultural upbringing might not even be aware that I'm doing something that's offensive. And I think this was noted earlier, that this is a fear that a lot of middle-aged white men have in having this conversation about race, is that I'm going to misspeak, I'm going to say something wrong and cause offense that I can't somehow take back. And I'm wondering about this point. For me, microaggressions because of the word aggression being in there, suggests intent to offend. And I'm wondering to what extent, is that the correct interpretation of this? Do you perceive it as an intended, an intention to cause offense, or is it more about ignorance? And then how do we tackle that? If it's ignorance, I suppose that's a little, well, both should be fixable. If it's intended, then there's a door to be shown to that person. But if it's ignorance, it doesn't cause any less offense. But how do we address that? And maybe, Marcia, are there practical, sort of more formal steps that you as an HR leader would do to try and nip this in the bud through training or other actions? What do you think?
Well, microaggression, you asked the question just now, is it ignorance or what was the other word that you used, Steve? Is it ignorance?
Well, intent.
Or intent.
Yeah.
And I do believe that it can be both. There are some people that are very ignorant of what it is and that they're even doing it. And there are some people that are doing it intentionally and doing it in a covert way. And I do think that, it's one of the things that very often affects retention in the workplace, because individuals don't like to complain about it, because then they are seen as they're always complaining, but it's the little things that people do that never get picked up on. And so people get fed up with it, and after a time they leave because they feel that it's not being dealt with, and they feel seen it as though they're always complaining. But microaggression, it is real, and it's real for the person that is experiencing it, and can be done in a very, very subtle way. But just to come back to what you said, it can be intentional, or it could be that the person is so ignorant that they don't even understand what microaggression actually means, and that they're actually doing it to their work colleagues.
And I think that's it, isn't it? That the fact that it's not intended doesn't mitigate the offense that's been caused and the pain that it's causing the employees. So it needs to be rubbed out. And your point, the micro part of it makes it even more awkward to call it out, because I could see how it might feel petty because it's a micro thing, but it does build up. Yes. Naomi, did you want to comment as well? I saw.
Yeah, so we're seeing organizations start to roll out training on this, sometimes specifically aimed at senior leadership, because for leaders to create inclusive environments, they need to firstly understand microaggressions and the impact they have, and then also understand the importance of them intervening when they happen. Because quite often things that happen, for example, people constantly getting someone's name wrong, even though they've worked somewhere for 3 years, or people making very odd and hurtful comments about people's hair if it's not the hair they're used to seeing all the time. These are not nice things, and they shouldn't be things people have to experience regularly. But if senior leadership aren't aware of them / don't know that they ought to be intervening, they will persist. And so that training that requires people to be ready to have an uncomfortable conversation is very important. And I think when coming to that training or those conversations, the thing I always suggest is, instead of centering first how you're feeling about that conversation and your fears about maybe doing something wrong, to instead reflect on the experience of people who have to experience this on a regular basis. Because any discomfort you might feel whilst in the training or whilst trying to learn or improve will probably be quite small in comparison to the experience of somebody who had their colleagues get their name wrong for 2 years, for example. And so it's just about not centering yourself. It's very rarely about, you as an individual being a bad person. It's about what can we all learn to ensure that something's inclusive. And if you come to it from that perspective, then it's a lot easier to, I think, have these conversations and work towards making things better for everybody else.
Thank you. Now we're down to just 3 minutes, but I'd like to give you all a chance, if there's anything that you didn't get to put out there yet, to quickly do so. Sort of a final word. Maybe we'll just run back through the original order. Marcia, was there anything that you wanted to say that you didn't get a chance to because the question didn't come up?
Yeah, I think we probably covered it, but I think it's important that we recognize that retention starts from the recruitment. And it's very important that we have leaders with an understanding of what is important to all the talent, not just some of the talent within their organization, and what it truly means to Black talent to have an accessible and inclusive working environment so that they can bring their whole self to work. And leaders and executives need to understand that the organizational culture is crucial to building a diverse workforce. And it's also imperative that an environment is created which supports success for Black talent and individuals from all backgrounds. So not just about color, but individuals from all backgrounds.
Thanks, Marcia. Dennis, final word?
Not really much to add from my perspective. I think we covered it all off, but I think it's just to reiterate to my white colleagues who may want to be allies, definitely take the approach of having the conversation, going through the education, and just trying to improve yourself. That's probably all that we can ask for, and take action where you see fit.
Thanks, Dennis. Naomi?
I think retention requires intention, and it's about doing things intentionally. So intentionally monitoring data, intentionally creating an environment or putting on training to help create the environment that's needed, and intentionally seeking to retain talent. You don't want to be in the position where someone leaves and you say, oh no, they were brilliant. But if you didn't tell them they were brilliant, and if you didn't make a point of making them know that you valued them and wanted them to stay, you can't be surprised if they leave. So it's about being intentional at all points.
Thanks, Naomi. And finally, Warren.
Yeah, I think, like Dennis said, I think most things have been said, but my final word would be, as I noted at the beginning, people leave for a number of reasons. People leaving isn't always a bad thing. However, I think when it comes to Black people leaving disproportionate to their white counterparts, as the data has shown time and time again, from my perspective anyway, it really boils down to the relationships that Black people sometimes miss out on, such as with sponsors or mentors for that matter, but primarily I think sponsors, and laterally as well with their peers, which if they miss out on those, it might not necessarily mean that they don't get the strategic leg up, but it does mean that they don't necessarily have the emotional ties with the organization, which would otherwise be a pull factor for them not to leave and go to a more attractive, take up a more attractive opportunity, which many Black employees have, as you know, that in most fields at the moment, the competition for diverse talent is exceptionally fierce. So really, in terms of actions that firms can take, really take, when it comes to D&I initiatives, really focus on ones which either foster a sense of community and belonging, or those which take positive actions to try and close the inequality gaps. We touched on those already, but I think those should be the main focuses rather than performative outward focusing events. I think this panel has been brilliant, but I don't think every organization needs to have an annual panel and then think, for example, I've checked the box, I've done my D&I for the year, which is what a lot of organizations do tend to do, and that isn't the answer to retention.
Thank you. Thank you all. I've found it to be a really, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you this afternoon, and you've given me loads to think about. I've learned a lot, and it's been great, and lots of positive feedback coming through the chat as well. So now, thank you all very much, and I'm happy to hand over to Marcia Balasiano to bring us all home. Thanks everyone for your attention and your contributions.
Thank you, Steve. Wow, that was really great. So much practical advice. And I think what was key for me is that recruitment is only the beginning. Retention, as Naomi said, needs to be intentional. Just some very quick takeaways. Marcia saying about communication, be sure to have open and honest dialogue. Dennis, have those role models, but you need champions as well. And ensure that they get those stretch assignments and really get the stuff that's really interesting, that's going to let them shine and progress in their careers. Naomi, think about exit interviews, reverse mentoring, address the stay gap, And then Warren, so helpful in talking about the culture that we need to create. Has to be one where there's intellectual rigor, positive action, stamp out those microaggressions. So those are some of the things that I heard said, and including very practical advice. Each one of us needs to stand up for our Black colleagues. I want to encourage you, if you are not already a member of the UK network of the Global Compact, you're not a signatory to the Global Compact, please join us. Contact any one of us, and maybe Carla, you can quickly put into the chat the web address for the UK network where people can get more information. We have some amazing programs and networks like SDG Innovators around the Sustainable Development Goals, SDG Ambition, Target Gender Equality, also a Diversity Inclusion Working Group, very appropriate to our conversation this afternoon. I also want to thank our sponsors for today, of course, NatWest for the whole entire series, which has been so helpful, and to Crown Agents Bank, not only for giving us Marcia today, but for sponsoring the session. And as you can see on your screen, we've got great programming coming up. Black Lives Matter and Business Advancement on the 10th of November, and then Black Lives Matter and Business, Changing Corporate Culture. And as Cynthia mentioned, we'll be joined by Sanda Ojiembo, the Executive Director of the Global Compact. So that would be a real pleasure to have her and hear her thoughts as well. So thank you to everyone, and we look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you.
Thanks, Marcia.
Thanks
everyone.
all.
Yeah.
Everyone, thank you so much.